Welcome, everyone. This is Taylor with Sovereign Submission, and joining me today is Stephen Bradford Long. Glad to have you back on the show. It's been a minute.
Yeah, it has been a minute. It's great. It's always great talking to you.
Likewise, I have, as always, been continuing to follow your work, and I know that you're following mine. And I think, one of the things that is really important to me in terms of the work that I do with around submissive men is also the men's work piece. The piece of, how do we embrace and experience healthy masculinity in all of its forms. And lately, one of the things that I've really appreciated are some of the pieces that you've been sharing on your Substack. There were two that stood out to me. One was one that came out yesterday at the time of this recording, which is around loving men, and the other was around tough guys not crying. And I put for the the tentative title was for this was tough guys cry, you just don't see the tears. Because
Yes,
I thought it was rather appropriate.
absolutely. Yeah.
So I
y- Yeah.
so I think what I want to talk about first, though, is the one around loving men, because I think this is such an it it brought up such an interesting response for me, which was, yeah, for a long time I didn't love men,
hmm
and the reason why was because I loathed myself. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts around that? I mean, I think, sure, we see right now. I mean, I've certainly seen a number of things out there from women. I've seen stuff around the concept of decentering men. I've seen stuff around like a variety of things along those lines. But I think, what about men's relationships with themselves?
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
hear your thoughts on that, especially
So,
because you're not a heterosexual male. And so
no.
you have your own
No.
perspective on it, which is rather unique and very important.
So let me quickly put my phone on Do Not Disturb. So I, it is amateur hour up in here. I should have done that first. And I'm just going to hold my phone because my stand is I'm watching my phone slowly slip down like this and it's going to hit the desk. So I'm just going to hold my phone and make everyone seasick. Um so yeah, loving men. So it, I always have a challenge when I write about this topic,
Mhm,
which is that kind of at heart I'm kind of a liberal universalist. And what I mean by that is that I believe that the two single most important features of any person is that they are an individual and they are a human, and that transcends everything.
mhm.
That transcends gay orientation. My cat is breaking down the door trying to get in. Come on. Come in. Come in. All right. Every a cat has to make an appearance in every live that I do. Um the individual and the human has to trump everything else, right? Sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender, nationality, race, and being a man and a woman, right? And I think that our ethics need to be rooted in something beyond, and our sense of meaning needs to be rooted in those two poles of identity, the individual and the human, right? And so that's what I really believe. And so there's a big part of me that really just wants to eschew this whole thing and
Mhm.
say, let's just focus on being a good human. And I do believe that. I do believe that it starts with being a good human. What I keep running into is that then there's all that stuff in the middle between being an individual on the one hand and being a human on the other hand. There's all that stuff in the middle. And it turns out that under certain circumstances, that stuff is really important. And so I'm always hesitant to write a piece like the one that I wrote. which is emphasizing masculinity when my ethics and my worldview tend to say, well, let's just focus on being human. Um, but the fact is that I am a gay man and I adore men and I love men because they are men, right? I for me, being gay means not only that I really love individual men. My hair is a goddamn mess this morning. For me, being a man, for me being gay does not just mean that I love individual men for who they are. You know, I have my partner, John, we've been together for over a decade, and I love him most of all for those salient things, his personality, his moral strength, his humor, all of that stuff. But I also love him because he's a man, because I'm gay, right? And so I love masculinity. I think masculinity is gorgeous. I love how wild it is. I love how rough it is. I also love the vulnerabilities of masculinity, and I also love being a man. Now, so
I want to
imagine my
I want to I want to comment on something here.
yes, please, yes, please.
Yeah. First, I want to welcome Ray and Andrew. Glad to have you both here. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop those in at any time. Um, I think, I mean, one, I resonate with you on the whole, like, well, look, at the base, we're all human beings. That's what we are, right? We're human beings. And I wrestle with this also because it's like, I tried to get away from my identity as a man in a way for a long time, but I couldn't get away from it, whether I liked it or not. And there was a long period of time where I didn't like it. I'm a man. Now I do like it. I've learned to love the fact that I'm a man. I've learned to like the fact that I'm a man. And it's not about the liking or the loving of the privilege of being a man. I mean, yes, there is the aspect of privilege that comes into play in some ways. There's and there's also but there's also all the other things. There's all the challenges around it as well. What I've learned to like and love about it is this is a part of my identity that when I accepted it, it actually allows me to integrate more toward that humanness that I feel is so essential. And it allows me to see the humanity in the people around me in a different way because I'm not judging them for a piece of their identity that they have no control over. I have no control over the fact that I'm a man. I mean, I guess the closest I would say is that I could make a deliberate choice if I wanted to change my gender, um, and to change the bits and go through hormone therapy and all that stuff. I'm not interested in doing that. So really, I mean, this is, you know, this is an inherent part of my identity, at least for this lifetime. Maybe in another lifetime, I'll incarnate as something else, and that'll be a different thing. But it's who and what I am.
That what you just said about how accepting it is, and maybe even learning to love it is actually helping you be a better human is for me the important for me is the important part. The What I focus on in the article is the dissonance I feel as a gay man who loves men, who loves being a man in, one could say, left of center spaces
Hmm.
where, I talk to fellow progressives, liberals, leftists, whatever you like, both men and women, to be clear, right? My article is not targeted at women, it's targeted at everyone, both men and women included. And I just experienced this dismay of wondering, do my do my friends and colleagues love men? Because I don't get the feeling very often that they do. what I hear is a lot of criticism of men, which is great. Criticize men. Absolutely. There's a lot of bullshit. There's a lot of there's a lot of harm. There's 100% do that. But so often it is paired with a complete absence of love for the masculine. And what is notably lacking for me in so much discourse about men is an absence of love for the masculine. And
Mhm.
I just find that as someone who loves men, as someone who is biologically and spiritually wired to just absolutely adore men platonically and sexually, um, I find that really distressing. I find that really dismaying. I find that really tragic. And part of the reason is because I think that it's impossible to make a good life with someone. It is I think it is impossible to make a good life. I think it is impossible to live a full life if we hate an unchosen part of what we are, or if we hate the condition that half of humanity lives in through no fault of their own, or if we hate the essence, the unchosen state of our spouse, right? The person who shares our bed. I think that that just results in a life of misery, right? I
I would agree with that,
Yeah.
and I actually have personal experience with that because I remember I was involved with somebody for a little over a year, and she hated men,
Mm,
and that relationship was probably one of the worst relationships that I've ever been in. Actually, 2 people I can think of 2 different people that I was with. Yeah, because I remember some of the comments that they made, and it was one thing when there was, like, kind of, like it was one thing to accept that there was some kind of valid criticism, which at times there was,
yeah.
but what really stood out to me was how apparent it became to me that there was, like, that in a very real sense, that hatred carried over to the personal relationship as well, and it made it impossible for those relationships to work.
How did that hatred manifest itself?
For one of the for one per from one of the people involved, it was making jokes about men, like, mansplaining and things like that. Like, don't get me wrong, sometimes I get that,
Mhm.
but it was the way she made those jokes, and this was me right before I got into men's work. So I kinda went along with it because, again, I loathed myself at the time. I was like, "Oh, I'm a man, like, that's not a good thing." So, I didn't appreciate myself, and so it but that was ironically enough, her comments were part of what made me get into men's work, because
Hmm.
in breaking up with her, I was kinda like, "Well, I don't like myself as a man, and I don't know how to be a man in today's world. What am I gonna do with this? I need to figure this out." And so I got into men's work and started to realize that, especially as I began doing some self-love work, I began to realize just how important it was to learn how to love myself, but also to learn how to love my masculine identity and discover it. I want to welcome Dominance Academy and Zach. Glad to have you guys here. Again, if any of you have comments or questions as we are going through, please feel free to pop those in and I'll pay attention to them. In the second case, I was the person I was with. I had I was about I got involved with her about a half a year, maybe a little bit more into my journey of men's work. And at first, she seemed pretty receptive to it, but then she became really critical of it. And part of it was, I remember her once saying something to me like, "Every time I think I've gotten to know you, you change again." That was a comment on me.
Hmm.
But then sometimes she would make comments on me being a white man or me being a man. and like and the things that I didn't realize or look at in the world, and there was just a lot of hatred and anger there. And some of her criticisms were valid. Again, I'm not going to dismiss them, but a lot of times it really came through from a place of deep woundedness, from her own experiences, and her projecting her father onto me.
Hmm.
And I feel like I can look back now and I can feel a sense of like recognition of that I didn't at the time. But again, it was one of those cases where I ultimately ended up saying to her one day, like, I can't continue doing this.
Mhm.
The relationship was miserable. And I'm like, I don't want to spend the rest of my life with this person. Like, this isn't like I have half of my life left, and I'm not going to stay with this person out of obligation or anything else. Because one of the interesting dichotomies about it all was that she also wanted me to take care of her and provide for her. Like, on the one hand, she was all for she was definitely a progressive leftist person. So she was all for some of those, for all the things that are talked about. But then on the other hand, she also, in a very real sense, wanted to be taken care of and wanted things a certain way. And it was like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Like, which is it going to be? Like, if you want to hold these values, that's great, but then live those values. If you want me to take care of you and then put the pressure on me, for example, one time she got really upset when I started crying, and she was like, "That's not like you." She's like, "When you cry, that just seems really weird. You're a man. You shouldn't be crying." And I'm like, "Well, I do cry."
Mhm.
Guess what? I do cry, and I am a very emotive man, and I am perfectly comfortable being an emotive man. So it really just stood out to me because it was one of those cases where it's like, this is very clearly not somebody who's operating from a place of love toward me. And part of it was she didn't love this masculine identity, but at the same time, she wanted to take advantage of that masculine identity and use it.
You know, I have heard that so many times from so many of my male friends, and I've experienced it myself, where I do sometimes feel like there is a very confusing double standard with a confusing double standard that we get from the world as men, which is we receive the message, be more vulnerable, be more vulnerable, be more vulnerable, be more vulnerable, right? Be less toxically traditionally masculine. And then the revealed preference from a lot of people is that they prefer those more traditional toxic masculine roles. And especially when it comes to how men express emotion, right? And that's something that I've noticed and that I've experienced. And I think that there is kind of an innate I do think that there's kind of an innate contradiction or challenge where Phoebe Maltz Bovey recently wrote an interesting article about okay, I'm a gay man. I'm about to wade into territory that I know absolutely nothing fucking about. So keep that in mind. All right. But
All right, I've got you, brother. I got you.
okay. But there's what she wrote a very interesting article in which she basically says, straight women are still straight women. And uh, so there is an innate conflict of confronting maybe the abuses that they experience from men, but also why do they keep wanting to live with men, love men, partner with men? Well, it's because they're straight and they can't get rid of their straight sexuality, right? It and their sexual orientation continues to draw them to men, and I can see how for a lot of women that can cause uh w- a seemingly unresolvable conflict. And I also see this with men who are who are attracted to women. They are straight. They have been brutally wounded by women, and yet they are still attracted to women. And I can see how that creates like this extremely painful complex that results in lashing out, that results in kind of this blending of hatred and love. And one of the things that I get at in my article is how collective guilt, trauma, the great tragedy of trauma is that it excels in weaving stories of collective guilt, right? That those are the stories that trauma is best at. That the type of person who did something to you, that all people who fall into that type are bad, are dangerous. And that is the and trauma stories are are correct enough to feel convincing, but wrong enough to destroy our lives, right?
Mm,
And they excel in stories of collective guilt. And um and I see that thrown into the mix as well. And I could just as easily have written an article about women. Do you love women? I could just as easily have written that exact same article that I wrote about men. I didn't because I write about men, right? But I think so much of the collective animosity comes from like this tension and this complex of I'm attracted to men, or I can't get away from men, or I am a man, but I'm very hurt by men. And the trauma story of collective guilt suggests, well, that means it's all bad. And there's kind of this irreconcilable, painful, like wound there.
mm. I want to welcome Zanny and not Toby. The Dominance Academy asked, why subject oneself to the messages from the environment? Interesting question.
Good question. I think that we subject ourselves to the messages of our environment as long as we aren't aware that as long as we aren't aware of our environment. You know,
Yeah. Inner and outer.
yeah,
It's not just because environment is a very interesting term. You know what you were sharing earlier, and I think this kind of speaks to that question. Actually, is that like after I got out of that relationship that I shared, the one with the person, I was like, all right, I'm not dating for a while. I need to figure some things out here. One of the conclusions that I came to was I have a deep wound around my relationship with the feminine. And until I heal that wound with the feminine or integrate it, really, I'm not going to be able to be in a relationship without projecting that on to the feminine and to my encounters with the feminine. And that was one of the realizations I had because, yes, on the one hand, she was projecting her father wound onto me, and I was projecting my stepmom wound onto her. And I came to realize that it was something very and it was like that was part of the inner environment. And I'm like, um, one of the tropes that I see that is problematic about relationship advice is like, when you're in a relationship, you'll help each other heal. Like that shouldn't be the reason you're in a relationship with somebody. That is does so much damage and harm right there. Like I don't want to be in a relationship with somebody so that we can help each other heal.
yeah, yeah. Same.
I if and it's I'm not against the idea that some healing may occur in a relationship because legitimately it will. There are going to be times where there's ruptures in relationship and things need to be worked through and resolved and all that stuff. But if that's the majority of the work right there, if that's what is happening most of the time in the relationship, no thank you. I've been in relationships like that. The trauma ends up defining the relationship. The projections define the relationship.
Yeah, the shadow rather than the
The
gold.
the shadow rather than the gold. So a huge part of what I ended up doing was going and doing a lot of very intense work on myself over the course of 6 months, just resolving and working through that mother wound, that stepmom wound, and things like that. And I came out the other side in a very different way. And I think that it changed my relationship with myself as a man. It changed my relationship with the feminine within me. It changed my relationship with women because I was no longer operating from a place of projection.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So so question, and I ask this because this is something that I've been mulling over. You use terms like the feminine and your relationship to the feminine, and then there's the masculine. What is the feminine and the
Mm,
masculine, right? Because
yeah.
I hear these terms a lot, and there is inside of me kind of a gender critical uh there is a gender critical part of me that doesn't know what we're talking about when we talk about the masculine and the feminine. Is that culture, right? Is it just cultural programming? Is it, or or does gender not exist at all, and it's all just sex, and it's all just emergent from our biological sex? Or is there like a sexed soul, like a gendered essence, kind of like the anima and the animus, Jung's anima and animus, and whatnot. And you know, I ask
I think
that.
so I want to answer this, but if you want to continue, go ahead.
Well, my default for a long time has been kind of being kind of a gender abolitionist, right? Just being like they're just bodies, and I came from kind of a hard materialist perspective. Um, that's shifting now for me, right? I In part because I cannot deny that the masculine is real, that I experience the masculine is real. I love the masculine. I'm attracted to the masculine. I respond really powerfully to it. But as for what that thing is, I'm still trying to figure that out. And it's like the more I try to figure it out, the more complex and the more fraught it becomes. So, what are
Hmm.
your thoughts on that?
Hmm. I mean, on the one hand, I can look at it and say this is cultural categorization.
Hmm.
I think that even like the notions of traditional masculinity that we think of are really like we'd have to actually go back through history and like live in a different culture and see, well, like what was their experience of what masculinity is? Is this actually as traditional as people think it is?
Yeah, for sure.
Same thing for femininity. Like it's not. So I think on the one hand, there's the cultural. There's certainly the archetypical, like the Jungian archetypical thing, and it's interesting because I mean, like one of the things that I find problematic about polarity theory is that there's this tendency to say, okay, masculine equals active, feminine equals passive, and that's not been my experience.
Same.
Like
Yeah,
I find that
for sure. Same.
I find that the way that women are active differs from the way that men are active,
Hmm.
but it doesn't change the fact that they can be very active.
Hmm.
And Dominance Academy, it's polarizing energy. The terms are just used as placeholders. They are, but here's the problem with that. Those terms that are used as placeholders have come to define the conversation so much to the extent that they have created very narrow boxes. And the problem I have with using those terms as placeholders is that again, they deny something very fundamental about the aspects of like the active feminine. Okay, so the feminine's passive, yin, and all this other stuff. Well, no, it's not. I'm
So,
sorry.
so
It's
you're
not
coming at this.
always.
You're coming at this as a sub. Do you use
I'm
that
c-
term for
and
yourself?
yeah, I do, and I
Okay.
am coming at it as a sub
Yeah.
in some ways. Like it's not always. It's It's like I've met plenty of women who are very active, and I would not associate them with being in their masculine.
Yeah.
It's a
100.
very and so using those terms as placeholders is really problematic. It's something it's an article that I have coming out later on, where I look at that and I really critique it because it's like it's not, and it's the same thing where even as a sub, like I can be very active as a sub. You know, it's not, me being submissive does not mean that I'm passive.
Mhm.
I can be very active. So the thing is like with language, we do have to be really careful with how we use it. And I think that the way that it frames the conversations sometimes that I see online and some of the things that I see written and expressed is where I find it problematic. And so it's like, well, okay, how is this really serving us? It's again kind of the whole notion of like, well, if a man's feeling emotions, he's in his feminine. Not necessarily. I'm
Mhm.
feeling emotions. I'm a human being feeling emotions. And the way that I'm feeling emotions is just me feeling emotions.
Mhm.
There's nothing inherently masculine or feminine about that one way or another. It's just that I happen to be feeling emotions. Like when I cry, when the armor comes down and I'm crying over something, it doesn't make me one thing or another. So I think the convenience, what's seductive about the terminology is that it's very convenient. If I can label somebody in this way and pigeonhole them and box them in, great. But it's also what creates the performative pressure that I think both men and women feel in their respective roles.
Hmm.
And I don't, and so that's kind of where I'm coming at it from.
Yeah, I that's really interesting to me because, coming at it so you're coming at this as a sub, I'm coming at this as a gay guy,
Yeah.
and a lot of gay men are are often categorized as quote unquote feminine in a way that I really object to, right? I think that there is something, for example, guys who are subs, guys who are bottoms, guys who or whatever the case may be, guys who are a sub in a kink situation, etc. Having based on my own experiences in gay settings, there is something wildly masculine about that. There is and being in a receiving role sexually does not make one passive. In fact, very much the opposite. And it is wildly masculine. And in fact, some of the most wildly masculine experiences that I've had have been sexual experiences with other men, right? And so this is one reason why, or kind of outside the realm of sex, guys who are culturally more feminine, I see in a lot of those guys an extraordinarily strong masculinity, right? And I just and so there is and so I really object to the way masculine and feminine is divided, uh, because what a lot of people would deem feminine in the gay world, I see and have personally experienced as wildly masculine, extraordinarily masculine. And so, the whether it be twinks or femboys or bottoming or subbing or just general affectations of gay men that are labeled as more femme, I do not see those as quote unquote femme. Maybe they are on the surface, but beneath it, though, kind of m- the way I approach this is I make something masculine because I am the one doing it. It's the masculine touch. It's the King Midas's touch. And so I am not made feminine by what I do. I make those things masculine because I'm the one doing them. And I've really started to think of masculinity as a spectrum, that there
Mhm.
are many different types of masculinity, that there are many types of men, many different ways of being a man. And and I think that yeah, my experience as a gay guy really makes me skeptical from the outset of how we categorize what is masculine and what is feminine.
I wanna welcome Lindsay and Sharp Wave Ripple. Glad to have
Sharp Wave Ripple is one of my dear friends, by the way.
great. Well, glad to
Yeah.
have you all here. Well, and I mean, I think maybe part of it also comes down to conscious choice. If on the one hand I say like this action that I'm doing is something that helps me to strongly identify with my feminine, that's one thing. Okay, fair enough. Like that's something I'm claiming for myself. On the other hand, it's yeah. I mean, I think that this is one of the interesting thing that I see like when I sit in men's circles, like the act of receiving. Like this is one of the challenges, right? That a lot of men have, but it is a very masculine thing to receive, and it's part of that sovereign energy. If we want to get into the archetypical energy, in order to be the sovereign, we need to be able to receive, so then we can give the blessings.
Mm, mhm.
You know, that's something I've been exploring right now. I was talking with a friend of mine recently, sharing some of my challenges in life, and he's like, "I know where you're at." He's like, "You've been in the magician mode for a while." He's like, "You've been doing lots of planning and thinking." And he's like, "You need to get back into the warrior mode." And he's like, "And to do that, ultimately, what you need to do is get into your sovereign. You need to be able to balance the magician and the warrior in terms of how you execute on things in your life." And I'm like, "Huh, there's something to that." So like that's kind of that's and it's appropriate that, that all this is happening as I'm exploring this concept of sovereign submission, because it is really about what does it mean to kneel in power to somebody else?
Mm,
There's a very real action that I think is important to state, which is that as a submissive, I may be giving my power over to the dominant, and yet I am the one in power. I am choosing to give that power to someone else so that I can
yes.
receive from that person. So there is a sovereignty there that
Mm,
is really essential to
mm,
that action and that experience. And so a large part of what you're saying, like here around the receiving, is there is something very powerful and dynamic about it that goes through and and allows this deepening in to the experience. Yeah,
yeah.
it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. And, I've been also the Dominance Academy says, "Of course, it's not all Rambo," to which I say, "Yes, absolutely." Um, and
Sylvester Stallone.
it's also fine that guys are Rambo.
Right.
That's fine. It's fine when guys are Rambo, as well. Um, I I really enjoyed your work on submissive masculinity and on being a sub. I think it's so fascinating, and I think it's really valuable to expand or to explore what does it mean to be a man in the setting of subbing, in the experience of subbing. I think that that is such a fascinating topic. Um, and it connects for me to being gay, because so often masculinity is defined as being in opposition to or the opposite of the feminine, right?
Right.
And so there's so many books, kind of especially from the 90s, that framed masculinity and femininity as being in opposition to each other, right? And as a gay man, that just makes sense to me because that does not connect with me in a meaningful way. And because in my relationships, there really is no feminine. There is the feminine is not there. It is all masculinity. It is men all the way down. And um and so exploring what it means to be masculine or to be a man in a submissive relationship the way you do, or exploring what does it mean to be a man in a gay setting, in an all male setting, or in a gay relationship. Um, yeah, I don't know. It strikes me as pretty radical. Strikes me as pretty counter to prevailing narratives about masculinity.
It's definitely a counter to it. I mean, most of the men's coaches I see out there are one of the messages that they have is men need to lead
Hmm.
in relationship. Okay. So if we're always expected to lead, even though at the same time we're also told a contradictory message, well, no, we don't want you to lead in some cases. Yeah. It becomes a very interesting kind of tension there. And I think that like the other day I was talking with another submissive man and he said to me, "There's more of us out there than there's a lot more of us out there, aren't there?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "There are." And there isn't really there hasn't really been a space
Hmm.
in a lot of ways for exploring that. I mean, I've had a couple submissive men say like when I've shared some stuff like thank you, like you're giving me something, you're giving me a space here, you're giving me something that I haven't found before. That there is actually a space for me that it is possible for me to be submissive and to be male and to be proud to be both of those things and to be able to reconcile that.
Hmm. That's fantastic. I want to address what Dom.
Yeah, I was about to share that. So you said in gay relationships, does polarity not exist?
It absolutely exists. But it doesn't exist between masculine and feminine. The polarity is between masculine and masculine, right? And at least in my experience. And so it, there is polarity. There's also complementarity, right? But the complementarity in a relationship. So I've been in a long-term relationship for 11 years with my partner John. Um, and the complementarity isn't gendered, and instead so we don't have assigned social roles based on our sex, where one is the housemaker, the other is the breadwinner, that kind of stuff. Instead, it's really the complementarity is based on individual skill, and it's based on individual personality rather than male and female. We're both men. We both have um we both have skills that complement each other. We both have weaknesses that the other, or gaps that the other fills, no pun intended. Jesus. And we we both have um skills and deficits, and we kind of fill in those skills, those deficits for each other. But that's based on personality. That's based on life experience rather than being um, men and women.
I remember one time, this was in my early 20s, and I was flirting with a gay man. This was at a pagan gathering and we were flirting a bit. And I made a comment along those lines like, "Oh, like I'm in my feminine." And he said to me, he said, "Being gay has nothing to do with being feminine."
That's right.
And he's like, "I'm not like," he's like, "You're not, if you are exploring this, this is another expression of masculinity for you."
That's right.
And at the time, I didn't understand what that meant. Now
Mm,
I do, because I can
mhm.
look at it and say that. And it's it's kind of an it's an interesting thing to reflect on in light of your answer. Like hearing you just share that was like it brought that memory back up for me, and it's like, oh, now I get it. Like in a way that I didn't
Mhm.
clearly at the time because I was pretty clueless and not, and also very very much in a place of exploration around my sexuality and also trying to heal some of my wounding and trauma, sexual trauma from things, which wasn't necessarily the way to do it, but fortunately, I mean, in the end, no harm came of any of that. But it was very. I think it's again, it's interesting. Like you're right. You know, like there's this full range of of presence, and I'm not. And I want to be very clear. I'm not like saying, oh, we got to throw polarity out the window or anything like that. I just think that there's a much more nuanced
Yeah.
exploration of polarity that's warranted if we're going to be using it as a form of relationship. And I mean, part of the ends. Part of it really boils down to focusing on presence and awareness.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of the thing that I'm going toward instead of going with masculine and feminine, and I did see the question from, what are the 2 ends of the polarizing structure called if not labeled masculine and feminine? I mean, for me, part of it is when I look at it, I'm kinda like, well, which person is in we could say which person is in the receiving and which person is in the giving mode, certainly. I think part of it really boils down to presence. Like when I look at it, it's like, what does it mean for me as a submissive man to be in submissive presence? What does that look like? What
Mhm.
does it mean for the dominant to be in their dominant presence? What does that look like? There's a very real charge and exploration and energy there. And then of course for people who don't even necessarily identify as dominant or submissive, there's still nuanced aspects. We can certainly use masculine and feminine as placeholders, but again, if we're going to use it as placeholders, then we've got to be really careful about what the boxes that puts us in.
And I think that so I have 2 thoughts here. One thought is it's okay for people to really value the polarity between masculine and feminine. I think
Mhm.
that and there one of the things that I try to be really careful about is to kind of keep in mind people have a pretty diverse experience of sexuality. People have a pretty diverse experience of gender. And so I've talked to some straight guys, dear friends of mine, and we will start talking about sexual relationships, and they will really talk about how their relationship, the polarity between masculine and feminine is extremely important to them.
Mhm.
And I really believe them, right? I really uh and when I tell them that there's really no feminine, I don't experience any kind of feminine in my relationship with John. It's just all masculine. It is all just like deep blue all the way through. Their minds are kind of blown and they really can't conceptualize that. And I think that it is okay for us to give each other space to have kind of subjective experiences of this thing that just kind of blow each other's minds. That where we just kind of cannot grasp what um where we just kind of cannot grasp it. But the other thing that came to mind is where I urge caution with using the term masculine and feminine is how people is how if we say masculine is dominant, feminine is submissive, then it's extremely easy for a man to walk away from that framing and say, well, I'm not masculine. I'm not a man. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have this challenge with Scott Galloway's three P's, and which, by the way, I love Scott Galloway. And I think the three P's of masculinity that he lays out, provider, protector, and procreator, I think those are good, right? I think that men should strive to be those three P's. But here's the thing: what happens when a man becomes chronically ill, right? What
Oh,
happens?
like Vanderbeek.
Yeah, what happens when a man develops chronic pain? And is disabled because of that pain and is unable to provide, or what happens, or is unable to protect, and instead he is the one who needs protecting and he is the one who needs to be provided for. Does that therefore make him not a man? Or does that therefore make him not masculine? In my conception, no. That I think that the way we use the terms masculine and feminine um end up end up um instilling a really destructive message, which is if I am not these things at all times, or if I find myself at a point in life where I am not exhibiting these things, well, then am I a man? And I just think that that's a rabbit hole to avoid. I just think that that is a rabbit hole best avoided.
That's
Um,
one of the that's one of the challenges that I find for submissive men. Well, if I'm submissive, I'm not a man. This is something that I've heard, or I don't know if I'm a man if I'm submissive. Well, okay, what you know, it's like, well, we've taken away like if it's framed in that framework, it makes it really problematic. Um, The Dominance Academy said, I'm not saying they need to be used, but if those terms are not used, what opposing terms are used? And then he said, agreeably, it is difficult to properly label these things. But I know there's a stark fundamental difference between me and my sub. It's just easy. It's just easy to use mask and fem. And I get it. I mean,
yeah, yeah, I get that.
I
I
can
get that.
safely say that like it's the same thing which I experience with my mistress. Like I feel a demonstrable difference, and I could categorize her experience as the dominant feminine, and myself as the masculine submissive. I can experience her and her feminine as the dominant, and etc. So I'm not even. It's this is one of the things that I'm wrestling with right now, especially
Yeah,
as I get into more conversations with men who are wanting to explore, or who identify as submissive, and at the same time wrestle with, well, what space is there for me? Especially when what I'm told out there by pretty much everybody is I have to fit these specific roles. I have
yeah.
to do these specific things in order to be considered a man.
And actually, Dominance Academy kind of what he's saying brings to mind is that there are guys for whom their sub role is explicitly feminine, and I'm thinking of the sissies,
Mhm. Yeah,
the
that's true too.
femboys, right? The femboys, the sissies, where for them they are subs and they are femme, and those are wedded together. And I think that's okay. Of course.
I don't
Hey,
have any problem with
yeah,
someone expressing. I want to be very clear about that. I
yeah,
don't have any problem with somebody saying that that's what I need and that's what I get. It's not how I identify
hold
as a submissive man. Eh, And in talking with other submissive men, I found that not all of them do, and so I think it's just really again, it's that whole spectrum. We are allowed to have a spectrum of exploration around it, and I think that's a really important thing to recognize. The challenge, of course, is, well, okay, if we're told that if you identify this way, then this excommunicates you from this other expression of your identity, that's where it gets really
right, right.
problematic.
Yeah, and I think that Dominance Academy's question actually kind of gets to the heart of this, which is, well, what words do we use? And I think that that does start to I think our language does start to get kind of wibbly wobbly when we try to get into when we try to get really granular about this stuff. And by the way, Dominance Academy in the chat, you said I know there is a stark fundamental difference between me and my sub. It's just easy to use mask and fem. Are you in a is that a heterosexual relationship or a homosexual relationship? You don't need to answer, and if you don't want to, but I would be curious to know if the sub is male or trans or a woman or whatever the case may be. Um, I didn't expect to get like this deep into kink, but I'm always down to talk kink.
All
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
yes, heteronormative. Okay, cool. Got it. Got it.
Well, I mean, yeah, we kind of we kind of went there.
We kind of would know it's great. I
That's
could,
great. I'm enjoying it. I mean, this is part of what I'm about. So we
yeah, of
didn't.
course.
I mean, it wasn't gonna.
I uh I keep wanting to write more about kink and about sexuality, and I'm also just like, okay, how do I do this in a way that doesn't feel like I am invading all my subscribers' inboxes with not safe for work stuff? Because I find sexuality so fascinating, and I find kink so fascinating, and I really, really want to write more about it, and I want to find a way to do so that is beautiful, that also doesn't scare away half my audience. So,
Well, I
I'll
hear you on that,
yep,
and I think it's. I mean, I think it's interesting. My Substack has gone through a couple of iterative changes. First, it was the men's mysteries for a while, and then it moved over to sovereign submission. And then as I've been exploring that, I've been kind of looking at like, for one thing, like sometimes I'm going to write articles that's going to focus specifically on men's work, and sometimes I'm going to focus more on the submissive piece, and then finding like where there's an interesting intersection. Dominance Academy said maybe put a header on those pieces with an NSFW warning, and I think that's a good idea.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Then the people can choose. Like that's a good way to go about it.
for sure.
Um, and I think really like again, part of this is just this very part of it for me is like is that in a very real sense, like with I'm exploring my own journey around this as I'm fully deepening into this exploration of masculinity. I look back at the last year and change, and I think that one of the things that really stood out to me is like, I shared my story earlier about like the journey toward healing the feminine, but part of it was also like after that, I went on this journey where I kind of started to shed through various things the different definitions of masculinity and sexuality that weren't working for me that I had grabbed onto because it felt like those were the things I needed to grab onto
Hmm. Yeah.
in order to find a relationship, in order to find acceptance or things like that, and coming to realize like that doesn't really fundamentally work for me.
Mm,
I
mhm.
like I at one time I've shared this story elsewhere. I ended up taking a course on how to become a dominant man, and I actually took that course in part as a response to the relationship I was in with the person who was deeply traumatized by her experiences and was very critical of men. Because it was like, well, maybe because on the one hand, it was like, I'm hearing that you want this type of energy. And on the other hand, there's these other things. And it was a good course to take. It taught me a lot about myself. I think the biggest takeaway it taught me though was like, this isn't me.
Yeah.
And giving myself permission to step into that and then saying, well, then if that's not me, then then how do I reconcile who I am with my masculinity, which has become a very vital part of who I am, because it's something I've learned to love and accept about myself. And the
Mhm.
answer that I ultimately came away with is sovereign submission. This is about learning to step into my sovereignty and kneel from that in a place of submission that still ultimately is a form of empowerment.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I think that's beautiful. Um, well, I'm gonna have to head on here pretty soon.
Yeah, I was gonna
Um,
say we have things to go on to. So
we have, and we always also have so much to talk about every time we get on camera together. Um,
well, we'll have to do this again at some point, and I'm
yeah, of
sure it'll
course.
be just as nuanced and interesting a conversation as this one was.
Yeah, and seriously, anytime, especially as the days are getting longer, I'm starting to get more energy, and I have more margin to do things like this. So with spring, I have more capacity to do live. So yeah, truly, anytime.
All
I'm
right.
always
Well,
happy to hang out.
well, thank you, brother. Much love to you. And thank you to everyone who showed up. We really appreciate you being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for dropping in, and thank you, Taylor. This was awesome.
And there we go.